Good afternoon, and welcome to the session, Culturally Sustaining Online Pedagogy for Indigenous Languages. While the pandemic created openness toward online learning, project-based and immersive curricula are still rare, especially for Indigenous languages that need to create speakers rapidly. Our presenter will explore the process and outcome of creating such curricula in spite of paradoxes around place, relationships, orality, and technology. Please welcome Anka Albotaine from the University of Minnesota, who collaborated with Joe Shishoka Duta Bendixson from the University of Minnesota and Heather Suter from the University of Winnipeg.
Medakepi, yahi piken washte, dawa chiakapi, anamaya hoptan piken woyo oni hahachaya. Anka Albotaine makiapi, gamini sota makoche mataha, chante washte na pechi uzapia. Beto kinde Massachusetts tamakoche ed tito kawahi ka wopira awichawakia. O mashichut ka dakota oyate ore dakota yapikiwa unspe makiapiga he wopira tanka hecha. Hello, my relatives. It's an honor to be here with you today. I greet you all and thank you for coming. My name is Anka Albotaine, and I come from Minnesota Makoche, which is Dakota land. I'm grateful to be a guest in the land of the Massachusetts people today on their unceded territory. I'm a white settler, but some Dakota people have been kind enough to teach me their language, for which I'm very grateful. So I wanted to greet you in that language. You see me up here today, but there are many more important people listed on this slide, and I want to explain why. So we're very grateful to the Convention Committee for selecting us to be here for this bookmark session. It's really a great honor. It did create kind of a panic scenario for us, to be honest. And I was actually quite set on canceling and not coming because of the challenges that we encountered. However, it is our hope that this presentation would be helpful to other Indigenous communities, and I decided that it might be best to just honestly share with you the challenges that we encountered in showing up today, because they are relatively emblematic of the kinds of challenges that we face all the time doing this work for Indigenous languages. So my two co-presenters, one who's Dakota and one who's Métis, have actually both lost a parent in the last month. Not only is this heartbreaking and there's a lot of emotional care that needs to be done, but there are also spiritual responsibilities that they need to tend to during this time, so they're not available to travel here today. One of them actually also came down with COVID and is currently recovering. And so we did try to invite other colleagues who you will see and hear during this presentation to attend and be on the stage. But for most of them, the cost of travel, plus frankly the cost of entrance to the convention, was simply prohibitive. I did have one colleague who you will hear in the presentation who was able to secure funding for her travel, but had trouble securing childcare, and then actually got an opportunity that is rare and long awaited to record a particular fluent elder speaking in her language. This is important work and difficult to arrange, and she didn't want to miss that opportunity, so she didn't end up joining me today. These are all pretty typical challenges that we face in doing this kind of work, and I want to recognize and honor my colleagues for the multiple responsibilities that they carry and roles that they play in their communities while doing this challenging work. So this has resulted in me, with my various forms of privilege, putting this trip on a credit card and standing in front of you today. So you're seeing my face, you're hearing my name, and often that would result in me getting all the credit for this work, and I didn't want that to happen. So we've actually redesigned this presentation to involve a lot of videos, which hopefully will play, and these are from the people who are really doing the heavy lifting in this work. I've also noted their names on the slides. There are a few things that I will personally share, but most of the presentation will not be in my voice, and I appreciate your understanding as we use technology to put the focus where it belongs, on the Indigenous people doing this work for their own communities and their own families. So thank you for your patience and understanding. The work we're sharing about today is still in its infancy, but we have begun to develop and offer a comprehensive language learning program online through a nonprofit in Minnesota called Dakota Yapi Okoda Kichie. And we're also working on sharing this program design and curriculum with communities in North and South Dakota that speak Lakota, as well as Cree, Ojibwe, and Michif communities in Manitoba. We want to share how we are thinking about this design so that these programs will be sustainable, effective, and culturally sustaining. So let's start by clarifying that term. We know that languages can be taught online and that there are many types of language programs online. However, what we want to consider today comes in the context of the revitalization of Indigenous languages, where the very ways of thinking, ways of living, and ways of relating to one another that belong to the speaker society have been repressed and often crushed under colonialism and the mainstream culture of colonizers, which is me and my people. So our goal is not simply to talk about the world in the same European way, but using a language other than English, but rather it is imperative that we begin to talk about and experience the world in a way that aligns with the life ways of the speaker society. That means radically rethinking what a language program looks like, the values that underlie it, the formats that we use, and the experience that is had by the learners. Of course, some learners are like myself. We come from outside the community and we're learning these languages for intellectual and ethical reasons. But we are not the target audience for these language courses. The language courses are designed and intended to serve those who always had a right to speak this language and who lost access to it due to genocide and violence. So our endeavor is to create courses that serve to revitalize not only the language, but the lifeways and worldviews for those who are entitled to them. So we'll start by hearing from Heather Suter, who is the director of Wichita Indigenous Language Revitalization Circle, and who's leading our work to expand this programming to several language communities in Manitoba.
This work to design a comprehensive online option for learning Indigenous languages came out of our realization that while it's great to have universities and schools recognize the value of Indigenous languages and offer courses in them, these colonial institutions impose restrictions that are contrary to many of the key elements needed for effective language revitalization. For one thing, universities appeal to a certain age group, K-12 schools another. So whole community learning is not possible. They also require people to live close by or have the time to commute to classes. Another issue is when the courses are offered, sometimes during the workday, or sometimes the amount of time is severely restricted, like in K-12 schools where they only offer 30 minutes per week. These institutions also require a certain kind of assessment and grading that's often contrary to how languages are actually acquired and to our cultural ways of interacting and teaching. For example, they require exams, which we would prefer not to use. The key elements for this online work, which has been started in the Dakota community of Minnesota and is spreading outwards to different states and even the province of Manitoba in Canada, is that it makes language learning possible regardless of location, age, previous experience, academic background, whatever, and allows us curricular freedom and self-determination, in effect, educational and cultural sovereignty. We can show that we're meeting both actual and content standards, but doing so in a way that aligns with Indigenous ways of learning and teaching. While not everyone is comfortable with learning online, and it certainly has its limitations, we're working on culturally sustaining approaches that will reduce the anxiety caused by formal academic institutions. This is really important given that many Indigenous people have been significantly traumatized in these institutions and that anxiety has been shown to be a significant barrier to achievement in school and university courses.
So first, we'd like to show how the offerings of this online program are conceived based on the ACTFL levels. And already there are some considerations that incorporate both the reality of Indigenous language vitality and the values of the underlying culture. So in this case, we're going to talk about Dakota culture. While the ACTFL levels refer to the communicative competency that a student has, they of course do not prescribe content. Since our goal is the rapid revitalization of a highly endangered language, we aligned the content to the domains and registers of most urgent use. So yes, communicative complexity does increase throughout the levels of the course, but we also make sure to target the use of the language with children in the home at the very beginning, since this is the doorway to language vitality. And we move to relatively less urgent uses from there. This works well because so far a major audience for these courses has been parents, some of whom have children in our language nest or immersion schools, and they urgently need help supporting the language in the home. It's also important to note what happens at the other end of the scale. Because these are largely oral languages and relationship-based transmission is indispensable for both linguistic and cultural knowledge, beyond the upper intermediate levels, it's imperative that learners are working in close relationship with elders to be recipients of those teachings and learning to become teachers themselves. We'll hear more on that in a moment. I'd like to show you some quick glimpses of what this kind of course looks like. There are descriptions beside the videos, but for time reasons, I won't read them out loud.
Hamitakuye.
Hamitakuye.
Rini, dokere nichi apiha.
Rainy emakiapihe. Dokere nichiapihe.
Anka emakiapi. Tayayahi, hawashte. Wana owa sina. Woyahdaka pikta. Hamitakuye.
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 Nina washte.
Dokere nichiapihe.
Kiara Mikapi? Amikapi?
What's
Dodi?
that?
Dodi?
Dokere nichiapihe.
Dokere Nichiape.
Rainy emakiapi.
Rainy dokedonha.
Oh. Chante niwashte?
Chante washte.
Rainy, chante niwashte?
Chante mawaste. Achitu.
Tom. Rainy chante washte.
Rainy, chante washte.
Dayai chano. Dayai he pidamaya. He washte.
Birana.
Hamitakuye. Rainy.
Daku washte dakahe.
Owapie. Washte. Wake. No. Wadak. Washte dake.
Owapi washte wadake. Achituhe?
Ampetukinde wamatuka ichinsh ish mashtima ktaniha heeha hee
Washte. Ampetu kinde wamatuka dokchaon. Ichinsh khdani haha mishtime shni. Tichache duhahe.
Numba Shichecha Beduhe, Wanji Okshidan, Max Etchiape, Wanji Wichina, Harper Etchiape.
Washte. Oh, Chaje kin washte wadake. Harper got Max hey washte wadake. Got chisinapi guys tankapi.
Chistina.
This is one student's final product from a novice mid-course where they begin project-based immersion learning.
Hayetuke sinte chape kikta ga ihruziche. Ampetuke ishtime chish hayetu sinte chape shkate washterake. Tokahya irujajaga onka woyute yute. Pejuta sapagache ga ihaya wowa piyawa. Sinte chape kien tankad mani kaidoa pichu. Sinte chape ni na chante washte. Shteda. Sinte chape kien unkto me wayake.
This is a glimpse of a land-based, project-based unit in action, where a student is creating a video of her activities on the land using what she's learning in the online class.
Oh, wana dakto koha.
Umag toshu tehede.
How naku wana dakto koha.
Yakashke ka ehereye.
Daku unha.
We can
How we can't wash the.
Toshu owas yakashke.
Oh.
Atakiapi, Ishkia Machia Kapi, Washitu Ia Nakoli Makiapie, Dakota Ia Gakringuia Makiapie. Ampetuk de Sagye Ki Wakage. Tokahia Chanki Owade. Wakaske Shni Ichinch Wanietu Ata Heha Chanki Ti Mitawaki Idazata Manke. Unka Chanki Wiyu Homani Ki Wapasku. Peha, Chanki, Wawapiska, Wiyumaki, Wakasto.
Heather will now speak about why the advanced levels are being built in a specific way.
With many international languages, especially those not usually being learned as heritage languages, higher-level courses might focus on literature, writing skills, or business applications. With Indigenous languages, however, the primary goal is to reinvigorate intergenerational transmission of both the language and culture and affect the lifeways of the speaker community. So rather than provide relatively esoteric advanced courses and hope that learners find elders to learn from, that they can build successful relationships with and work with them in a way that's optimal for the creation of new speakers, we're designing the upper levels of this online program to directly engage learners in that work and directly teach them how to do it effectively. We've been adapting a well-proven master-apprentice approach, or MAP, to be possible even if the mentor speaker and the learner don't live close together, using some approachable technological tools like video chatting, Zoom, Facebook, phone calls, and voice messages. We're also working on ways that one mentor speaker can work with a small group of learners so that we can accelerate the transmission from those fluent speakers who are still living, so that multiple people, other families, communities can come to embody their language and teachings while we still have time. The core of this involves teaching both the fluent speaker and the learner to focus on communicative language teaching and task-based immersion. We teach them to create learning scenarios where they engage in an activity together, whether it be synchronously or asynchronously, and explore the language related to the activity in its full communicative form, with attention to variations such as regional dialects and different registers. One amazing example of this is an Ojibwe learner in her 40s who's working with a fluent speaker in her 60s. This learner often makes videos of herself out on the land, walking her dog, or picking plant medicines. The fluent speaker then watches these videos and describes the activities in them and sometimes even corrects the learner. But it's just not one way, it's reciprocal. The speaker is also finding that she's recalling language she hasn't heard or used in many years through this process as well.
Because this is content-based immersion teaching, we've taken care to align project-based units to more than one set of standards, and this is an evolving aspect of the work that will be tailored each time a new community begins to use this curriculum or approach. So we think about the 5 C's in some of the ways that you see here, but we also think about the social justice standards published by Teaching Tolerance and also the state content standards. So far, we've primarily worked with Minnesota standards, but we're beginning to work on South Dakota and Manitoba provincial standards, as well as we expand this approach to other communities, other dialects, and other languages. This is a major area where we have to employ what is called two-eyed seeing, meaning we have to see what the value of a unit is and what knowledge is going to be acquired during that unit from an Indigenous perspective and from a colonial perspective at the same time. Of course, there is room for us to teach lessons that are not valued in the colonial framework, but as often as possible, we want to assign our lessons some value within the colonial framework so that our program can be recognized by school districts and universities as conveying valuable knowledge. At the same time, we resist allowing the colonial framework to dictate the entirety of what is valuable knowledge. So it is standard aligned from the perspective of what is learned rather than how it is learned, and we are trying to decolonize the how. So we're deep in the work of decolonizing and trying to discover what that really means in practice and in the context of very new media. Each of the challenges that we are going to discuss in the coming slides may present initially as a paradox. And in each case, we acknowledge a tension, but in each case, we've developed some strategies to move forward in a way that we think is balanced and productive. Other communities may come to other conclusions or try other approaches. There's no prescription for all, but we will share how we have thought about and approached these tensions in each case. We'll start with Shishoka Dutta, the linguistic director of Dakota Yapi Okota Kichie, who's going to share some thoughts with you on the tension between allowing the curriculum to be dictated by student interests and passions and allowing the curriculum to center the wisdom of elders and the rules, taboos, and shared knowledge base of the Indigenous culture.
The relationship between a teacher and a student happens because the student needs to get something done. Usually something to help with survival or to improve the community. A lot of what young people need to learn is how to be a good relative. That requires lessons and mentors. So that has always been learned through relationships that are built between less experienced people and more experienced people. And then the teacher or elder or more experienced person doesn't give the learner a multiple choice exam to show whether they are getting better at doing something. No, they watch the person do it and give them feedback about what is going well and what can still be improved. So this way of building relationships has always existed for our Dakota people and helped people learn any skill they needed to become a good relative.
Another paradox that seems to emerge when we talk about Indigenous language learning online comes from the fact that Indigenous people, cultures, and languages are inseparable from the land. Everything about the language and its speakers is intimately related with their ancestral homelands, the land of which they were created as stewards. And so to remove location from the equation is to introduce a sort of void at the very center of our endeavor. The obvious solution to this is land back, rematriation, and restoration of all Indigenous rights and connections. In the absence of this, our work can never complete its purpose fully. But working as we are in an imperfect and colonial world, there are strategies that we employ to begin the process of reconnecting people, land, and language. So here are a few examples.
Hamidakuyapi yushkawachiakapi, Josh Dunn and Makiapi ka Dakota Iapi Okota Gichie and Dawani. Hello everybody, my name is Josh Dunn. I work for Dakota Iapi Okota Gichie. I also have a master's degree from University of Saskatchewan in Indigenous land-based education, and I also am an herbalist. So today I'm going to show you how I teach Indigenous land-based education in a virtual setting. So these are a few example slides from a Dakota Lakota plant medicine class that I've taught that's usually been bilingual with some English in there. I frame all of my classes with the idea of plants being our relatives, which sets us up with a very different mindset for approaching our environment wherever we might find ourselves than more of a capitalist extractive mindset. So one thing that I do is I have students who are all over the world taking my classes, but I encourage them to spend some time every week getting to know the plants around them, even if it's just observing what weeds they see popping up on their way, walking to and from wherever they go. So having them do regular check-ins with each other during the class encourages them to pay attention the rest of the week to what plants they might be seeing around them. And I just have a few examples of slides that I've given them about ethical harvesting and some of the principles for approaching the plant world. For example, learning to take some time and observe. So I'll encourage them to go do this on their own. And I gave a bunch of guidelines, questions for them to use when approaching different plants and areas that they may live in. Learning their local protocols, which are going to be different in all of the different places that they live. We also talk a lot about reciprocity, making offerings, and developing a relationship with the areas that we're harvesting from, which again is going to look different and in different places. And I'll set them up with questions to contemplate what ethical harvesting might mean in their area, how they can tend to the land or develop a relationship. So that's a little bit about how I get them to reflect. Also, when I'm teaching different plants, this, for example, is Chokhwanjicha, or an English willow, one of the plants that I teach. So one thing that I do, this basically says, where do we find this plant? So I have a bunch of range maps, sort of pointing people to, depending on which territories they might live in, where they might be able to find one of these plants in this group of plants. Even though we can't all be out on the land together, if it's a virtual class and I have students in northern Alberta and I have students in Hawaii and I have students in Maine, what we can do together is talk about taking certain approaches to plants, and then I give my students prompts and they can then use that information to go out and inform how they interact with plants during the week, and then come back the following week and check in with their students about that.
Here are a few other examples of how we keep land at the center of learning, even though we're location independent.
Ishta, Heberaska ishta, wamani chaki ta eapi. Ta ga ta chinchira. Wana ta manipi. Manipi. Taji chinchara. Ta chinchara. Tankad manipi. Naku daku e chumpe hai. What else are they doing? Mini yacht campi.
Drinking.
Adjective.
Dujashe? Dujasha?
Oh, iya dujajapi. Nuampi? Kita na nuampi.
The duck.
Kedaku.
Mapaksi janum.
We do also address this tension by interweaving in-person events, and we try to have the online courses build up to the activities on the land so that students have much of the language for the activity already when they're able to go out and do it. Another challenge is introducing such heavy use of technology when the fluent speakers of the language are generally elderly, and many teachers of the language have worked in an analog format for a long time.
Hamarakiapi ishkamatia kafi summer emakiapi sisito mokoje hemataha nakun wanietu shakoi hahaya dekoriapi omaspe. So hello everybody, my name is Summer. I am from Sistan. I've been studying Dakota language for about 7-ish years now. In my free time, I actually teach Dakota language, and I help other organizations also teach beginning Dakota language. Over the last few years, especially during COVID times, there has been a transition into online formats with learning Dakota, and I feel that that's extremely important, especially with how displaced our people are. Myself, I grew up off reservation, and I didn't really have a lot of access to my language and to other speakers, especially not first speakers. And so as I got older, I saw that, right, I knew that that was something that I really wanted to be able to do, was to be able to connect with first speakers. And so I've been lucky enough that throughout my career as a language teacher and as an informal language teacher, I've been able to kind of help other people bridge that gap. I think that COVID especially made that more apparent, that need to bridge that gap to connect first speakers with language learners across the nation, just because we're not all in the same place, of course, but it really also just helped to show that it is important to be able to bridge that barrier, because in order for us all to learn our language, we need to be able to overcome those obstacles. So one of the things I got to do is that I used to be a language intern coordinator, and so I worked for the Minneapolis American Indian Center. And there I got to work with college students, but I also got to help facilitate first language speakers or first language speaker meetings over Zoom. And so we worked with a first speaker from Sistan, and we worked with him to get on these meetings, and he would just talk in Dakota to myself and a few other students. I saw people from all kinds of communities that wouldn't normally be able to converse with first speakers that way. And so it was just overall really beneficial. I've also been a teacher or worked with Dakota Yapi Okota Kichie, and we have hosted online language camps as well through that. And again, been able to reach out to so many other people who may not live in their ancestral homelands. I think that there were a few challenges with that, specifically working with elders or first speakers. I was lucky enough that with the first speaker I worked with in Sistan, he had already been kind of transitioning to that online format anyway, and so it had people over where he lived that kind of helped to connect those things for him already, like showing him the setup and everything. But I do know that other speakers who have hopped on those meetings, they were not nearly as tech savvy. And so some of the things that I had to do was actually try to find online tutorials just on YouTube, just really simple links, and I would send that to them so that way they could kind of see firsthand how the format would work. But in order to kind of just streamline the process, I would be the one that set up the Zoom meetings, and so I would make it so that I was the host. And so I would only just send just the Zoom meeting invite, because it comes in a really long paragraph, and I would only send the one line that has the link. And I would set it so that controls weren't shared, which sounds a little kind of iffy, but it kind of helped because sometimes, especially if you're not too familiar with Zoom, it can get really easy to just accidentally share your screen or something like that. So I tried to make it so that way those control settings weren't shared, unless whichever speaker I was talking to was actually pretty comfortable working with that kind of technology. But a lot of it was trying to send tutorials ahead of time. I also did a lot of over the phone thing. In the time of COVID, it's really taught a lot of people how to be more tech savvy. And I think overall, though, it really did just kind of show how to really engage in ways that we might not be normally comfortable with. And that includes using Zoom, using other online formats, Facebook, for example, things like that. But I think the way that it's able to connect and bring everybody together has been the most beneficial thing that you could possibly get out of it, because I think in the end that's all we really want to do, is to be able to bring people together to speak with each other.
I think there was a slight error in the editing there, and Ichepashi Summer did also share that she would provide the support over the phone, but also sometimes actually traveling to elders' homes or having someone who's comfortable with the tech actually travel and help them. One thing that may be particular to Indigenous language teaching is that when transmitting culture, we have to be mindful of some taboos, some spiritual implications, and protocols for how, where, and when, and between whom knowledge should be passed. So we have some perspectives here and examples of how this can be approached, but with care.
Hamidakiapi, Rainy Cloud Amakiapia. So in teaching this course, I have students from different backgrounds. Some of them have grown up in Dakota their entire life. Some of them are just beginning to learn their culture, their language, and some of them are non-native. In my courses, I generally stick to teaching strictly language, and then in the parts of the course when it speaks to more of the cultural ways, I just really give vague information, and I really encourage my students, if they wanted to learn more about our Dakota Wichoha, our Dakota way of life, that they should seek out those resources, find people within the communities that they live, or find people in their family that have that knowledge.
And here are some examples of other instructors and how they have approached this.
Mija, Chawakabu, Chawakabu. Oha. Oha mitakepi. Wichasha kilena okawi chasha. Okawi chasha. Iuha eapo. Okawi chasha.
Okawi chasha.
Hechetu. Okawi chasha kile. Okawi chasha kile. Northern Cree echiapi. Northern Cree echiapi na is ewichakiapi. Northern Cree echiapi.
Alex, Okawi Chasha ga Ikchewi Chasha. Achituha? Daish.
Here,
yeah.
Tuekeash Dakota, na is Lakota, na is Hakatwa, oyate etaha piki hena iuha, oas Ikchewi Chasha hechapi. Ash. Dua oloa otas loyapi hantash o kawi chasha hecha.
Piramaya.
Yeah. Bruze. Kute. Kute. Mie. Mie wakute. Wakute. Leah, Yakute, Yakute. Wakute, Yakute, Chashkie, Kake, Kute, Kute. Kute. Hehan. Oh. Ma'o. Oh. Itazi. Pe kute hehan o ma'o o ma'o o ma'o de dako hai
Da kata o
ma'o ni o.
All right, this challenge is probably the thorniest one, which may surprise some of you, but there are actually some pretty intense controversies around whether these languages should even ever be written, and if so, how and by whom. We approach this with a pragmatism that is focused on maintaining cultural values without sacrificing the efficiency with which we create new speakers of the language. We'll show you why we use an orthography and then some examples of how we try to use it thoughtfully. One teacher likes to say that instead of fighting in English about how to write the language, let's all get fluent and then we can fight about it in the language. So that's the kind of spirit that we try to have as we move forward. This is again Shoshone Duda.
Originally, Dakota was an oral language, so the orthography was initially developed by European Americans.
So you can see there's been a great effort over the years, over the past 150 plus, 160 plus years to write down our language and to make an effort to do whatever can be done to pass it on and write it. So a point to illustrate here would be like the word for the word skunk. Now, there is a variation in Dakota, but a lot of Lakota people will say maka or skunk. Now, if we were writing it in the original alphabet with rigs, it would also be written maka. But there is for earth, there's a maka. So the orthography we use in this class, we put a KH there to indicate the aspiration. So a word like Maka might be written like this. Maka. But to illustrate it's not grandmother skunk and it's Mother Earth, grandmother Earth, we put a H there to illustrate the difference.
An important way that we address this is through the asynchronous learning materials we make available. So here you'll see how we put spoken language at the center. You see writing as a support at the lower levels, and then increasingly the resources provide only spoken language.
Hokshidan, Hokshidan, Hokshidan. Iyunke, Iyunke, Imuranki Iyunke, Iyunkaya.
De tatoka da chichada hecha. De tachincha da hecha.
Tatanka gala koroya tekya. Dakoshkashka ia daha hinape. Makoche kinga happy go ha gaunga happy. Hohu unkitawa bikin ia daha chu tanchan kin makai taha ganari unkitawa bikin ie taha gatate taha gawakia bi taha chu. Kin Maka chareate. Maka yuke ga maka okshan ha yanke ka ha yok paze hechaya.
So here you see us assessing for only spoken language. In this case, students answer questions asynchronously by embedding recordings of their answers into a video that asks them questions.
Hamitakuye. Setrag emakiapi. Doke iniciapie.
Victoria makiapi. Doke de iniciapi he. Wamatuka. I chinch bezuta sapa beduhe shni.
So they are consistently asked to put spontaneous oral language first. There's so much that we haven't been able to show you in this short presentation, and it's really difficult to share the involvement of children, but I wanted to just share this one glimpse of this child who grew up in language immersion, recording a talking book and helping to make resources for other learners. This is just one way that we ensure that all generations can be involved.
Matoki.
Thank you so much for your attention. We really hope that you find this helpful for the work you're doing in your communities, and we'd love to connect with you if you want to do this kind of work. Henanai Pikte.